The thud hit my fence so hard it rattled the bolts. Then came that sharp hiss, like cardboard sliding through a gap in the wood. I sprinted outside, but by the time I reached my porch, the package was already gone, vanished in seconds. All that remained was a loose fence panel swinging slightly in the breeze, and fresh heel marks pressed into the grass on my side of the property line. Comment below where you are watching from, because this was the 7th stolen delivery in 3 weeks, and every single one disappeared the same way, through that fence, into the yard of Pamela Kensington, the HOA president who acted like she owned the entire neighborhood. I had no proof yet, just suspicions, circumstantial evidence, and a growing certainty that the woman next door was robbing me blind while fining me for leaving my trash can out 3 minutes late. But something in me shifted that morning. Not anger, clarity. If she wanted to keep reaching through my fence, fine. I would give her exactly what she was looking for. I just needed to make sure the next thing she grabbed would blow up in her face. She had no idea what was coming. I had moved to Willowbrook Estates 6 months earlier, chasing the dream that every remote software engineer chases. A quiet neighborhood, a modest house with a home office, enough space to breathe without the chaos of downtown Denver. The real estate listing had promised community, safety, and the kind of peaceful suburban life you see in commercials for lawn care products. What it failed to mention was Pamela Kensington. But I am getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to that Saturday morning, to the moment when I realized something was very, very wrong. The package that vanished contained a 2-terabyte solid-state drive worth $189. I needed it for a client project with a deadline breathing down my neck. I had been on a video call when the delivery arrived, unable to step away. 15 minutes later, the box had evaporated into thin air. I walked the perimeter of my property once, scanning every corner where a package might have been misplaced. Nothing. Someone had taken it. Someone fast. Someone who knew exactly when I would be occupied. I was still processing this when the doorbell rang, and I opened it to find a woman who would soon become the center of my universe for all the wrong reasons. Pamela Kensington stood on my porch with the posture of someone who had never been told no in her entire life. She wore a cream-colored dress so white it seemed to glow against the morning sun. Her platinum blonde hair was shellacked into a helmet that could survive a hurricane. She held a clipboard against her chest like a shield, and her smile contained all the warmth of a January frost. Behind those designer reading glasses perched on her head, her eyes performed a quick inventory of everything wrong with my existence. She did not introduce herself. She did not ask how I was doing. She simply announced that I violated Community Code 47B, subsection 3. My trash can had been visible from the street at 9:03 that morning, 3 minutes past the deadline for returning waste receptacles to storage. Third offense, $75. She extended a yellow carbon copy slip toward me, with the practiced motion of someone who had done this thousands of times before. I tried to explain that I was dealing with a more pressing issue. Packages had been disappearing from my porch. 7 in 3 weeks. Nearly $1,000 in stolen goods. I asked if the HOA had any security measures, any community cameras, anything that might help identify the thief. Pamela tilted her head like a bird, examining a particularly stupid worm. The HOA, she informed me, was not responsible for individual property matters. Package theft was between me and my shipping carrier. Perhaps I should consider improving my delivery arrangements. Or perhaps, she added with a thin smile, someone in my household was collecting packages without informing me. I lived alone. She knew I lived alone. The HOA had my residency forms on file. That comment was not ignorance. It was a mockery. I felt something cold settle in my stomach as I watched her turn and walk back toward her property, which sat directly adjacent to mine. That was when I noticed 2 things that would eventually change everything. The first was her garage door, slightly ajar, revealing a stack of brown boxes inside. Boxes with familiar logos. The second was the wooden fence separating our backyards. Specifically, one panel near the far corner seemed to be sitting at a slight angle, not quite flush with its neighbors. The grass beneath that panel was pressed down in a pattern that suggested regular foot traffic, and in that compressed grass, I could make out the distinct impression of a high heel. I looked back at Pamela Kensington's retreating figure, at her cream-colored pumps clicking against the sidewalk, at the massive diamond ring catching sunlight on her left hand. Then I looked at my empty porch, then at the loose fence panel. Something clicked into place in my mind, like a key turning in a lock. I spent the next hour on the phone, learning exactly how little the system cared about people like me. Amazon offered a refund, but explained that investigating theft was beyond their scope. The police department informed me that $189 did not meet their threshold for investigation. Property crimes under $500 were essentially civil matters. No detective would be assigned. I called the HOA last, hoping for a community alert about package theft. The phone rang 4 times before a familiar voice answered. Pamela Kensington, speaking as board president. This time her tone was different, clipped, impatient. She cut me off mid-sentence to explain that the HOA board did not have bandwidth to address speculative concerns. If I had evidence of criminal activity, I should contact law enforcement. If I had complaints about board policy, I could submit a written request to be added to the agenda at the next quarterly meeting. Then she wished me a pleasant afternoon and disconnected the call before I could respond. That night, I sat in my home office staring at my computer screen, unable to focus on the project that was now delayed because of a missing hard drive. I opened a browser and typed a search query that would begin my education in suburban warfare. The results were overwhelming. Thousands of posts, articles, and videos about homeowners associations gone wrong, about board presidents who wielded their positions like weapons, about neighbors who had been driven from their homes by accumulated fines and legal threats. One comment on a forum stood out from the rest. It was simple, direct, and it planted a seed that would grow into something much larger. Document everything, it said. They always slip up. But you need proof. I read that sentence 3 times, letting it sink into my bones. I picked up my phone and walked to my back window. The loose fence panel was barely visible in the darkness, but I knew exactly where it was. I knew what it meant. And I knew that somewhere in Pamela Kensington's garage, my packages were sitting in a stack, stolen by the very woman who had just fined me for a 3-minute infraction. But knowing and proving were 2 different things. I opened my phone's camera app and took the first photograph. The fence panel, slightly askew, was captured in the dim glow of my porch light. It was not much. It was not proof. But it was a beginning. I created a new folder in my cloud storage and named it with 2 words that would define the next several months of my life. Kensington Evidence. Then I went to bed, already planning my next move. The system had failed me at every turn. Fine. I would build my own system. And when I was ready, Pamela Kensington would learn what happens when you underestimate a software engineer with nothing left to lose. The HOA held monthly board meetings on the first Wednesday of each month at 7 p.m. in the community center. I had never attended one before. Most residents did not bother, which was exactly how Pamela Kensington liked it. Low attendance meant low accountability. But 4 days after my 7th package disappeared, I walked into that fluorescent-lit conference room, determined to make my voice heard. The space was arranged like a courtroom, with 5 board members seated behind a long table at the front and rows of folding chairs facing them like pews. Pamela sat in the center, elevated slightly above her colleagues by virtue of a chair that seemed intentionally taller than the others. The other 4 members flanked her in varying postures of deference, though I noticed the secretary, a retired attorney named Marcus Webb, watching the proceedings with an expression that suggested something less than enthusiasm. When public comments opened, I raised my hand. Pamela acknowledged me with a smile that did not reach her eyes and invited me to approach the microphone. I stated my name and address, for the record, then explained the situation as calmly as I could manage. 7 packages were stolen in 3 weeks, nearly $1,000 in losses, a clear pattern suggesting targeted theft. I proposed that the HOA consider installing community security cameras at key entry points, funded by the existing budget surplus mentioned in the annual report. It seemed like a reasonable request, a common-sense solution that would benefit everyone. I finished speaking and waited for a response. Pamela let the silence stretch before she spoke. She thanked me for my enthusiasm as a newer member of the community, then explained that the board had already evaluated camera proposals twice in the past 5 years. Both times, the initiative failed due to liability concerns and resident objections about surveillance overreach. She was not going to reopen a settled debate based on one person's unverified claims about missing deliveries. Perhaps, she suggested, I could provide documentation from law enforcement confirming an actual pattern of theft in our area. Until then, the board would focus on matters with established community support. She glanced at her colleagues, who nodded in synchronized agreement. Marcus Webb's nod came half a second late, I noticed. Then Pamela moved to the next agenda item before I could respond. 3 days later, I found an envelope in my mailbox containing official HOA violation notices. 2 of them. The first cited me for a front lawn exceeding the maximum grass height of 3 inches. I measured immediately and found my grass to be 2.8 inches at its tallest point. The second claimed my front door was painted in a color not approved by the architectural committee, despite documentation showing that exact color had been approved when the previous owner sold me the house. Total fines came to $225, due within 14 days. Failure to pay would result in a lien against my property. The message was unmistakable. This was punishment for speaking up. I spent the following days knocking on doors, hoping to find neighbors who shared my concerns. Jake Morrison, a guy roughly my age who lived across the street, was the only one willing to talk. He admitted he had also lost packages and harbored the same suspicions I did, but he warned me against pursuing it further. 3 years ago, Pamela had sued a resident for defamation after he accused her of misusing HOA funds. The case dragged on for 18 months. The guy eventually sold his house at a loss and moved to another state rather than continue fighting. His name was still whispered around the neighborhood as a cautionary tale. Jake also mentioned something potentially useful. Marcus Webb, the attorney on the board, supposedly disagreed with many of Pamela's methods. He never spoke up publicly, but neighbors who had been around long enough noticed his reluctance. Whether that meant anything actionable, Jake could not say, but it was something. The other neighbors I approached were less forthcoming. The Nelsons practically closed their door in my face, the wife whispering that they could not afford trouble with the board before her husband pulled her inside. An elderly couple on the corner pretended not to be home, despite their car sitting in the driveway. The pattern was clear. Pamela had spent years cultivating fear throughout this community. People did not refuse to help because they did not believe me. They refused because they believed me completely and knew what happened to people who challenged her. The following week, Pamela created a neighborhood watch group on social media. Her first post was clearly about me, though she never used my name. She warned community members about certain newer residents causing disruptions at board meetings and demonstrating patterns of non-compliance. These individuals, she wrote, seemed more interested in assigning blame than taking personal responsibility. She encouraged neighbors to report any concerning behavior they observed. The comments filled with supportive responses and thinly veiled references to my house, my presumed character, my unfitness for community living. I screenshot everything, adding each image to my evidence folder with timestamps and usernames preserved. That night, I called my mother in Ohio. Barbara Reed had raised me alone after my father left, working 2 jobs while putting herself through night school. 15 years ago, she had won a workplace harassment lawsuit against a company that tried to force her out after she reported discrimination. She understood what it meant to fight a system designed to crush you. She listened without interruption as I explained everything. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she told me something that reframed my entire approach. She said people like Pamela counted on their victims feeling isolated. They won by making you believe fighting back was impossible. But you were never actually alone, You just had not found your evidence yet. She reminded me of her own case. HR dismissed her complaints. Co-workers refused to corroborate. Her attorney called it borderline unwinnable. She won anyway because she documented everything, until her record was so comprehensive that no judge could ignore it. Stop waiting for others to validate your experience, she told me. Build a case that validates itself. Then she said something I would carry through everything that followed. The truth does not need allies. It only needs evidence. I hung up and sat in darkness for a long time, thinking about fence panels and heel marks and boxes stacked in garages. My mother was right. I had been waiting for someone to believe me, waiting for the system to work, waiting for justice to arrive on its own. But justice does not arrive. It has to be built, piece by piece, document by document, frame by frame. I opened my laptop and researched home security cameras with cloud storage and motion detection. By midnight, I had ordered everything I needed, shipped to a P.O. box downtown where Pamela could not intercept them. The real work was about to begin. Intelligence as a weapon. The cameras arrived at my P.O. box 3 days later, 4 wireless units with motion detection and cloud storage, plus 1 trail camera designed for wildlife photography. I installed them with the methodical precision of someone who writes code for a living, positioning each device to create overlapping fields of coverage with no blind spots. The most important placement was the trail camera, hidden in bushes directly facing the loose fence panel. You would have to know exactly where to look to find it. By nightfall, my property had become a surveillance grid, and for the first time in weeks, I felt something other than helpless. I felt prepared. While the cameras kept watch, I educated myself. Colorado law classified theft under $2,000 as a Class 2 misdemeanor, carrying up to 120 days in jail. But the real leverage came from federal statute. Title 18 Pushed. Section 1708 made theft of delivered packages a federal crime punishable by up to 5 years in prison. I also discovered that HOA board members had fiduciary duties under Colorado law and could be removed by majority vote for cause. Pamela had been operating as if she were untouchable, but the legal framework to bring her down already existed. She had simply never encountered anyone willing to use it. The first breakthrough came 9 days after the cameras went live. A package arrived containing a technical manual worth $32. I was on a video call when the delivery notification appeared, but instead of rushing to retrieve it, I let it sit. I wanted to see what would happen. At 2:51 p.m., the trail camera detected motion. I watched the footage that evening with my pulse hammering against my ribs. A hand reached through the gap in the fence panel. A woman's hand, well manicured, adorned with a diamond ring that caught the afternoon sunlight like a signal flare. The hand grasped my package and pulled it through in less than 8 seconds. I paused on the clearest frame, studying that ring. I had seen it every time Pamela knocked on my door to deliver violation notices. Now I had her on video. 4 days later, it happened again. This time, my doorbell camera captured what the trail camera could not. Pamela emerged from her back door exactly 90 seconds after the delivery truck departed, wearing dark athletic clothes instead of her usual pristine white. No gardening tools, no pretense of yard work. She walked directly to the fence with the confidence of someone following a routine perfected over years, retrieved the package containing my $45 laptop adapter, and disappeared back inside in under 2 minutes. The contrast between this calculated efficiency and her public persona as the neighborhood's moral guardian made my stomach turn. How many of my neighbors had she robbed while lecturing them about grass height and trash can placement? I built a spreadsheet to track everything: dates, times, item descriptions, values, video links. The pattern crystallized immediately. Packages only vanished when Pamela was home. 2 deliveries that arrived during her absence remained untouched on my porch. By the end of the second week, I had documented over $900 in losses with video evidence of the method. Each new entry felt like loading ammunition into a weapon I was slowly learning to aim. Then came the email that shifted everything. Subject line: coffee. Sender Marcus Webb. He wrote that my comments at the board meeting had stayed with him and wondered if I might speak privately, away from the neighborhood. I read the message 3 times, weighing the possibility of a trap against the potential of an ally. The risk felt worth taking. We met the following afternoon at a coffee shop 15 miles from Willowbrook Estates. Marcus looked different outside the boardroom, less guarded, more weary. He ordered black coffee and sat across from me in a corner booth where our conversation could not be overheard. For a long moment, he simply studied my face, as if making a final decision. Then he started talking. He told me he had practiced civil litigation for 35 years before retiring. He knew how to recognize abuse of power. He had watched Pamela target residents who questioned her authority for over a decade, manufacturing violations to punish dissent, using legal threats to silence opposition. 3 families had been driven from the neighborhood during her reign. 11 formal complaints had been filed against her. Every single one was withdrawn before resolution. He admitted his own silence with visible shame. He had protected his peace by convincing himself it was not his fight. But watching me stand alone at that meeting had stirred something he thought had died long ago. He slid a folded paper across the table. Names, dates, descriptions, 11 residents who had filed complaints against Pamela over the years. Contact information for those he could still locate. Some had moved away. Others still lived nearby, cowed into silence but potentially willing to speak if they believed they would not be standing alone. He explained that his position on the board gave him access to records and conversations that would vanish the moment Pamela perceived him as disloyal. He could not support me publicly, not yet, but he could provide intelligence. And when the time came, when I had built something strong enough to withstand her inevitable counterattack, he would not vote against the truth. I asked him why now. Why me? He was quiet for a moment, turning his coffee cup in his hands. Then he said something that landed like a weight in my chest. He told me that in 35 years of practicing law, he had learned that injustice persists not because evil people are strong, but because good people convince themselves that silence is neutral. It is not. Silence is a choice. And he was tired of making the wrong one. We shook hands before parting. Walking back to my car, I felt the list of names folded in my pocket like a promise. 11 people who had tried to fight Pamela and failed. 11 potential witnesses who might testify if someone finally built a case worth believing in. 11 reasons to keep going. For the first time since this nightmare began, the anger in my chest had company. It was joined by something sharper, something more dangerous. Hope. Not the passive hope that things might get better on their own, but the active hope of someone holding a blueprint for justice. I was no longer alone, and Pamela Kensington had no idea what was coming. The idea came to me while watching videos of porch pirates getting caught. There was an entire genre dedicated to homeowners rigging packages with glitter bombs, air horns, or foul-smelling liquids. The reactions were satisfying to watch, but most of those traps had a critical flaw. They were designed for humiliation, not prosecution. Glitter made a mess, but proved nothing. Stink bombs triggered laughter, but not arrests. I needed something different, something that would mark the thief in a way that could not be denied, could not be washed off, and could not be explained away as a coincidence. I needed evidence that would literally stick to Pamela Kensington's skin. I spent 3 days researching dye packs. Banks had used them for decades to mark stolen cash, deploying bright, indelible ink that exploded when a robber left the premises. The same principle could work for packages. Commercial-grade fabric dye combined with a spring-loaded mechanism would create a burst of color impossible to remove quickly. I added ultraviolet reactive powder to the design, invisible to the naked eye, but glowing bright under black light. Even if Pamela somehow scrubbed the visible dye from her skin, the UV residue would remain for days. I was building a trap with redundant proof systems, because when you only get one shot at justice, you cannot afford a single point of failure. The engineering was straightforward for someone with my background. I constructed a false bottom inside an authentic Amazon box, creating a hidden compartment for the dye reservoir. A simple pull cord connected the lid to a spring mechanism. When the box opened, Tension released, and the die packet launched upward with enough force to spray everything within a 6-foot radius. I tested the prototype 3 times in my garage, adjusting the spring tension until the coverage was perfect. Not too weak to miss, not too strong to cause injury. Colorado law permitted reasonable measures to protect personal property, but anything that inflicted bodily harm could expose me to liability. The die was messy and permanent, but completely harmless. Pamela would be stained, not injured, humiliated, not hurt, caught, not martyred. While perfecting the device, I organized my evidence into a comprehensive package that could withstand legal scrutiny. I created separate folders for each category of documentation. Video recordings with preserved timestamps and metadata. Screenshots of the defamatory social media posts with usernames and dates intact. Delivery receipts matched against proof of theft. The fraudulent HOA violation notices were annotated with measurements and documentation proving their falseness. A detailed timeline correlating Pamela's movements with each disappearance. Legal research summarizing applicable state and federal statutes. By the time I finished, the folder contained over 200 individual files. Any prosecutor who reviewed it would find a case already built for them, requiring nothing but the will to pursue it. The list Marcus had given me proved even more valuable than I anticipated. I spent a week reaching out to former victims, approaching each conversation carefully. Tom and Patricia O'Brien had moved to Arizona 2 years earlier after Pamela fined them $2,000 for planting unapproved flowers. When I explained what I was building, Patricia's voice cracked with something between anger and relief. She told me Pamela had changed their HOA guidelines retroactively, adding the flower restriction after they had already planted their garden, then cited them for a rule that did not exist when they made their landscaping decisions. They still had documentation proving the timeline. They had kept it for 2 years, hoping someone would eventually care enough to look. They agreed to provide a written statement and testify if needed. David Reynolds had sold his home 14 months ago after losing what he estimated to be 30 packages over 2 years. He never had proof, only suspicion and a pattern that matched mine exactly. Packages vanished only when Pamela was home. They arrived safely when she traveled. He filed a police report once, but without evidence. Nothing came of it. When I told him I had video footage documenting the method, he went silent for a long moment. Then he asked what he could do to help. I told him I needed witnesses willing to establish a pattern of behavior extending beyond my own experience. He agreed immediately. Another name checked off the list. Another voice added to the chorus that would eventually drown out Pamela's denials. Not everyone was willing to participate. Some former victims had moved on psychologically and refused to revisit the trauma. Others feared retaliation despite no longer living in the neighborhood. But by the end of my outreach, I had secured 6 people willing to sign a formal complaint requesting an emergency HOA meeting. 4 were prepared to provide statements to police documenting their own losses and suspicions. 2 had physical evidence, emails and documents that corroborated a pattern of targeted harassment stretching back years. The coalition was small but solid. More importantly, it proved that my experience was not isolated. Pamela had been doing this for a long time. She had simply never encountered a victim stubborn enough to connect the dots. I sent Marcus a text on Friday evening. 2 words, "It is ready." His response came within minutes. "Good luck. I will see you at the quarterly meeting." The quarterly meeting was 3 weeks away, the next scheduled gathering where homeowners could raise issues before the full board. If everything went according to plan, that meeting would be very different from any that had come before. But first, I needed Pamela to take the bait. Monday morning arrived gray and cool, typical for late September in Colorado. I placed an order through my usual delivery service for a small electronics component, valued at $50, scheduled to arrive Thursday afternoon between 2 and 4 p.m. The order was real, the tracking number legitimate, and the delivery confirmation authentic. I let the system work normally, establishing a paper trail that would prove I had received a genuine package at my address. Then I prepared the switch. Thursday at 1:45. I would retrieve the real package the moment it arrived and replace it with my modified decoy. The cameras would record everything, documenting a clear chain of custody that no defense attorney could challenge. Wednesday night, I barely slept. I lay in bed running through scenarios, anticipating problems, mentally rehearsing every step. What if the delivery was late? What if Pamela was not home? What if she somehow sensed the trap? I forced myself to breathe slowly, to trust the preparation, to remember that I had built redundancies into every element of the plan. The cameras were recording. The evidence was organized. The witnesses were ready. The die pack was tested and loaded. Everything that could be controlled had been controlled. The rest was up to Pamela Kensington and the arrogance that had protected her for so long. Thursday dawned bright and clear. I sat in my home office, laptop open to the camera feeds, phone in hand, waiting for the delivery notification that would set everything in motion. The trap was baited. The stage was set. And somewhere next door, completely unaware that her world was about to collapse, Pamela Kensington was probably reviewing her clipboard, looking for new violations to cite, new neighbors to harass, new victims to silence. She had no idea that her next theft would be her last. She had no idea that the package waiting on my porch was not a delivery. It was a detonator, and I was ready to watch her pull the pin. Boom. Thursday afternoon arrived with the kind of crisp autumn clarity that makes everything feel sharper, more real. I positioned myself in my home office by noon, laptop open to a 4-way split screen showing all camera feeds. The most critical was the trail camera hidden in the bushes, its lens fixed on the loose fence panel that had become the center of my universe. I pretended to work on a client project, but my attention never strayed from those rectangles of video. Every passing car made my pulse jump. The waiting was its own kind of torture, stretched tight across hours that refused to move. The delivery truck appeared at 1:53 p.m. I watched it roll down Oakwood Lane, my heart pounding against my ribs. The driver placed the package on my porch, snapped a confirmation photo, and returned to his truck without a second glance. The notification appeared on my phone 8 seconds later. Delivered. I forced myself to wait 60 seconds, watching for any movement from Pamela's property. Nothing. Her house sat quiet and still. I took a breath and walked out my back door. The switch took less than a minute. I retrieved the genuine package from the porch and replaced it with the decoy I had prepared. The boxes were nearly identical, both bearing authentic labeling, both looking exactly like dozens of previous deliveries. The only difference was what waited inside. I returned to my office and confirmed the decoy was positioned correctly on the camera. It sat on the porch, innocent and unremarkable. $50 of bait waiting for a predator who did not know she was being hunted. The trap was set. Now I just needed Pamela to be Pamela. She emerged from her back door at 2:11 p.m. I leaned forward, breath catching, as her figure appeared on the trail camera. She was wearing white. Of course, she was wearing white, a cream-colored linen dress, pristine and elegant, the uniform of a woman who considered herself above ordinary life. She carried a gardening trowel in one hand, a prop so obvious it almost made me laugh. In weeks of watching, I had never seen her actually tend to her garden. The tools were camouflaged, plausible deniability wrapped in a sun hat. She walked directly to the fence without pretense. At 2:12 p.m. she reached the loose panel, glanced around for observers, and saw nothing. She did not notice the tiny lens hidden 3 feet away. Routine had made her careless. She pulled the panel aside, reached through, and dragged my package into her yard in less than 10 seconds. Efficient, practiced, and about to have the worst day of her life. She examined the box briefly, checking the label with a satisfied smile. Then she stopped in the middle of her backyard, set down the trowel, and began picking at the tape. My finger hovered over my phone, ready to capture the moment. She pulled back the cardboard flaps. She looked inside, and then the world turned purple. The die pack erupted with a sharp pneumatic hiss, a geyser of violet ink spraying upward in a cone that caught Pamela directly in the face and chest. She screamed, a sound of pure shock that reached me faintly through closed windows, and stumbled backward as her hands flew up to shield her eyes. Too late. Her cream-colored dress became a canvas of purple streaks. Her platinum hair hung in violet clumps. Her face, neck, and arms were stained in brilliant, indelible color that would take weeks to fade. The ultraviolet powder mixed into the formula would linger even longer, invisible but glowing under black light. She fell onto the grass, clawing at her skin as if she could wipe away what had already bonded to every pore. I saved the video immediately, creating 3 backups before she stopped thrashing. The cameras had captured everything with intact timestamps, an unbroken chain of evidence from her back door to her purple-stained collapse. Something rose in my chest that was not quite satisfaction. It was vindication. After months of gaslighting and false accusations, I finally had proof that could not be denied or explained away. Pamela staggered to her feet and disappeared into her house. I heard water running through the walls, imagined her scrubbing frantically at stains that would not budge. She was marked, literally and permanently. The hunter had become the prey. The sirens came 47 minutes later. I had expected her to flip the script, to cast herself as the victim of an unprovoked attack. An ambulance arrived alongside the squad car, as if she had convinced the dispatcher she was suffering a medical emergency. I watched through my window as an officer approached my door, while paramedics rushed toward her house with a stretcher they would not need. The knock came sharp and official. Officer Daniels, a tired-looking man in his 40s, regarded me with the weary skepticism of someone who had seen too many neighbor disputes. He informed me a complaint alleged I had attacked a neighbor with a chemical substance. I told him that was not accurate. I had placed a dye pack on my own property to catch a thief, and the complainant was the thief herself. I had video evidence. His eyebrow rose. I invited him inside and played the footage from the moment Pamela left her house to the dye explosion. His expression shifted from skepticism to surprise, to something like amusement. He watched it 3 times, taking notes, then asked if I wanted to file a formal complaint. I handed him the folder I had prepared: documentation of 11 thefts, video evidence, delivery records, and applicable statutes. He flipped through slowly, eyebrows climbing with each page, then excused himself to make a call. Through my window, I watched him speak into his radio, then cross toward Pamela's house. On the trail camera feed, I could see her in her backyard, purple-stained and furious, gesturing wildly at paramedics who had found nothing requiring attention. Officer Daniels approached with documents in hand. I could not hear his words, but I watched her body language shift from indignation to confusion to panic. She shook her head. She pointed at my house. She raised her voice, fragments reaching me through the walls. Victim. Attack. Sue. Daniels waited for her to finish, then spoke again, gesturing toward the evidence folder. Pamela went very still. And then, in a moment I will remember forever, he reached for his handcuffs. She was read her rights on her own front lawn, purple dye streaking her face, cream dress ruined beyond salvation. A crowd of neighbors had gathered, drawn by sirens and spectacle. Jake Morrison stood with phone raised, recording everything. The Nelsons watched from their porch in shocked disbelief. Dorothy Simmons, the elderly board member who had always feared Pamela, stood at her driveway edge with tears streaming down her face. As the squad car pulled away with Pamela in the back seat, still stained violet from collar to hairline, I felt months of frustration lift from my shoulders. This was not over. There would be hearings and trials and complications I could not foresee, but watching the woman who had tormented so many finally face consequences, I allowed myself to feel something I had almost forgotten was possible. I felt like I had won. The video went viral before sunset. Jake Morrison had captured everything from across the street. Pamela being read her rights on her own lawn, purple dye streaking her face, handcuffs clicking around her wrists as neighbors watched in stunned silence. He uploaded it that evening with a caption about instant karma, and by morning, it had been viewed over 2 million times. The comments section exploded with stories from people who had experienced their own HOA nightmares, their own encounters with petty tyrants drunk on minor power. News outlets picked it up within 48 hours. Local stations in Denver ran segments featuring screenshots of Pamela's pristine white dress transformed into a violet mess. National programs followed, framing the story as a tale of one man's clever revenge against a neighborhood bully. The hashtag #PurplePamela began appearing everywhere, spawning memes and merchandise and countless reaction videos. By the end of the week, Pamela Kensington had become the most famous HOA president in America, though not in the way she had ever imagined. The community response was immediate and overwhelming. Neighbors who had avoided eye contact for months suddenly appeared at my door with apologies, explanations, and stories of their own. The Nelsons came first, the wife clutching her husband's arm as she explained that Pamela had once threatened to report them to immigration authorities, despite their being naturalized citizens for over a decade. They had kept silent out of fear, she said. Fear that no one would believe them, fear that fighting back would only make things worse. They were sorry. They should have spoken up sooner. I told them there was nothing to apologize for. Pamela had spent years cultivating that fear, weaponizing it against anyone who might challenge her. The blame belonged to her, not to her victims. 8 more households reached out over the following days, each with similar stories of intimidation and harassment. 5 of them confirmed they had also lost packages over the years and suspected the same thing I had proven. The pattern Pamela had maintained for so long was finally visible, exposed by a single act of resistance that gave others permission to speak. The emergency HOA meeting was scheduled for 2 weeks after Pamela's arrest. Under Colorado law, any action to remove a board member required a properly noticed assembly with quorum present. Marcus Webb, now serving as acting president, had sent notifications to every household in Willowbrook Estates explaining the agenda and urging attendance. The response exceeded anything the community had seen in decades. When I arrived at the community center that evening, the parking lot was overflowing. Cars lined the streets for 3 blocks in every direction. Inside, the main hall had been configured with folding chairs to accommodate the crowd, and still people stood along the walls and spilled into the corridor. I counted over 180 residents present, more than triple the typical turnout. The air hummed with tension and anticipation. Something historic was about to happen, and everyone knew it. Marcus called the meeting to order and explained the procedures. Pamela had been released on bail, but was not present, advised by her attorney to avoid public appearances while criminal charges were pending. Her absence felt appropriate somehow, a void where her dominating presence had once commanded the room. Marcus invited me to address the assembly. I walked to the front and connected my laptop to the projector, then presented the evidence I had compiled over months of investigation. The videos played on the large screen, showing Pamela's hand reaching through the fence, her casual theft of package after package, her confident smile before the dye explosion transformed her pristine image into something unrecognizable. The room watched in absolute silence. When the footage ended, I displayed the timeline of thefts, the pattern analysis, the exposed dollar amounts, $924 stolen from me alone, potentially thousands more from other residents over the years. Then the testimonies began. Tom O'Brien appeared via video call from Arizona, his wife Patricia beside him. He described how Pamela had retroactively changed HOA guidelines to create violations that did not exist when they made their landscaping decisions. They had documentation proving the timeline manipulation, emails showing dates that contradicted the official record. They had kept those documents for 2 years, hoping someone would eventually care enough to look. Emily Hartman spoke next, standing at the microphone with visible trembling. She described how Pamela had discovered her husband's history of depression and threatened to inform his employer that he was mentally unstable unless Emily voted to support a fee increase. The room gasped audibly. Emily had never told anyone before. She said she had been too ashamed, too afraid. But watching Pamela finally face consequences had given her the courage she did not know she possessed. David Reynolds spoke last, describing 30 packages lost over 2 years, a police report filed and ignored, a suspicion he could never prove until he saw my video and recognized the exact method he had suspected all along. Marcus called for the vote. The motion to remove Pamela Kensington from the board required a simple majority of those present. He asked for a show of hands in favor. Arms rose throughout the room like a wave, 181 hands reaching toward the ceiling. He asked for hands opposed. 2 people near the back, friends of Pamela who had benefited from her favoritism over the years, raised their arms defiantly. 4 abstained. The motion carried with 97% support. A cheer erupted through the hall, applause and shouts of relief from people who had lived under Pamela's shadow for nearly a decade. Marcus banged a gavel for order, then announced a second motion requesting a full financial audit of HOA funds for the past 8 years. This vote was even more decisive. 185 in favor, none opposed, 2 abstentions. Whatever secrets Pamela had been hiding in those accounts would soon be exposed. Then Linda Crawford asked to speak. The former treasurer had been sitting quietly in the front row throughout the proceedings, her face pale and drawn. She approached the microphone with the hesitant steps of someone walking toward confession. What she revealed silenced the room completely. She had known for years that Pamela was misusing HOA funds, diverting money earmarked for community maintenance to pay for her personal legal fees against residents who challenged her authority. $47,000 over 8 years, hidden through creative accounting that Linda had been too intimidated to expose. Pamela had discovered a tax issue in Linda's past and held it over her head, threatening to report her to federal authorities if she ever spoke up. Linda's voice cracked as she apologized to the community, to all the people whose dues had funded Pamela's campaign of harassment. She knew she was complicit. She knew she should have been braver. But she was speaking now, and she would cooperate fully with any investigation. The meeting adjourned after nearly 3 hours. As people filed out into the cool night air, I found myself standing near the exit, receiving handshakes and thanks from neighbors whose names I was only beginning to learn. Dorothy Simmons, the elderly board member who had wept during Pamela's arrest, gripped my hand with surprising strength. She told me that I had given them all something precious, something Pamela had stolen long before she started taking packages. I had given them their dignity back. I did not know what to say. I had started this fight to protect my own property, to prove I was not crazy, to stop a thief who happened to live next door. I never expected it to become something larger. But standing in that doorway, watching my neighbors talk and laugh with a freedom they had not felt in years, I understood that justice has a way of expanding beyond its original boundaries. One person's resistance can become a community's liberation. One act of defiance can break chains that everyone thought were permanent. Pamela Kensington had built her power on silence and fear. Tonight, both had finally been shattered. The legal system moved with a deliberateness that felt almost anticlimactic after the drama of Pamela's arrest. 6 weeks passed between that purple-stained perp walk and her first court appearance. Weeks filled with depositions, evidence reviews, and negotiations between attorneys. The charges filed against her read like a catalog of suburban crimes. 11 counts of theft under Colorado state law, each representing a documented package taken from my property. Criminal mischief for the repeated trespassing. Harassment for the coordinated campaign of false violations and public defamation. The district attorney had also forwarded evidence to federal prosecutors regarding mail theft, a crime that carried significantly harsher penalties under Title 18 of the United States Code. And looming behind all of it was the embezzlement investigation triggered by Linda Crawford's confession. With forensic accountants combing through 8 years of HOA financial records, searching for the full extent of the missing $47,000, Pamela's attorney, a cousin who had represented her pro bono in previous disputes, attempted several strategies to minimize the damage. He argued entrapment, claiming I had deliberately lured his client into committing a crime. The judge dismissed this quickly, noting that placing a package on your own porch does not constitute entrapment regardless of what is inside. He claimed the diamond pack constituted assault, but medical reports confirmed Pamela had suffered no injury beyond cosmetic staining that faded within 3 weeks. He suggested the videos had been manipulated, but forensic analysis confirmed the metadata was intact and unaltered. Each argument crumbled under the weight of evidence I had spent months assembling. Documentation does not lie, and I had documented everything. The sentencing hearing took place on a gray Tuesday morning in early December. Pamela appeared in court, looking diminished, her usual imperious bearing replaced by something closer to exhaustion. The cream-colored wardrobe had been abandoned in favor of a dark navy suit, as if she hoped the change might help people forget the viral images that had made her infamous. It did not work. The courtroom gallery was packed with Willowbrook residents who had driven 40 minutes to witness the conclusion of a story that had consumed our community for months. I sat in the front row, flanked by Marcus Webb and Emily Hartman, watching as the judge reviewed the case file with methodical attention. The verdict on state charges was guilty on all counts. The sentence reflected both the severity of the pattern and the judge's recognition that Pamela posed no physical danger to the community. 18 months in jail, suspended in favor of 3 years probation. 400 hours of community service, full restitution of $924 to me, plus court costs, a 5-year restraining order prohibiting any contact with me or my property, and perhaps most significantly, for someone who had built her identity around controlling others. She was banned from serving on any HOA board in Colorado for 10 years. The federal mail theft charge remained pending, with prosecutors indicating they intended to pursue it separately. If convicted, she faced up to 5 years in federal prison. The embezzlement investigation was also ongoing, with preliminary findings suggesting the actual amount missing from HOA funds might exceed $60,000 once all the accounting tricks were untangled. The social consequences proved equally devastating. Her husband Richard, who had been living separately for over a year, filed for divorce within a week of the sentencing. Their daughter, Ashley, a marketing executive in California, stopped returning calls entirely. The house Pamela had ruled from for so long now sat under lien, its value insufficient to cover the legal fees and potential civil judgments accumulating against her. The woman who had terrorized our neighborhood for nearly a decade had been reduced to a cautionary tale, a punchline, a hashtag that people invoked whenever they encountered petty tyranny in their own communities. Purple Pamela had become shorthand for karma, for consequences, for the inevitable fall that awaits those who mistake cruelty for strength. Willowbrook Estates began its own transformation under Marcus Webb's interim leadership. The reforms passed at that historic meeting were implemented with surprising speed. Financial transparency became mandatory, with all HOA accounts accessible to any resident who requested review. A formal appeals process was established for fines, requiring independent verification before any penalty could be enforced. Term limits prevented any future president from serving more than 4 consecutive years. Security cameras were installed at community entry points, funded by the budget surplus that had accumulated under Pamela's tight-fisted management, and a whistleblower protection policy guaranteed that residents who reported misconduct would be shielded from retaliation. The rules Pamela had exploited for years were being rewritten to prevent anyone from following her example. The former victims received what closure the system could provide. Tom and Patricia O'Brien accepted a formal apology from the board, along with full reimbursement of the $2,000 they had been wrongfully fined. Emily Hartman was connected with a counseling service, the costs covered by HOA funds, as acknowledgement of the psychological harm she had endured. David Reynolds filed a civil suit with documentation I helped him compile, ultimately settling for $3,200 in damages. 7 other residents who had paid fraudulent fines over the years received refunds totaling nearly $9,000. The money could not erase what had happened, but it represented something important. It represented the community finally admitting that wrongs had been committed and taking responsibility for making them right. I met Marcus for coffee a few days after the sentencing, at the same downtown shop where he had first slid that list of names across the table. We sat in the same corner booth, but everything else had changed. He looked lighter somehow. The weight of years of silent complicity finally lifted from his shoulders. He told me he had practiced law for 35 years and watched countless cases of injustice go unaddressed because good people convinced themselves that speaking up was not worth the risk. He had been one of those people. He had chosen comfort over conscience and rationalized it as pragmatism. Watching me refuse to accept that calculus had forced him to confront his own cowardice. He thanked me for that, though I told him the thanks belonged to him as well. I could not have done this alone. None of us could have. That was the real lesson Pamela never understood. She believed power came from isolation, from keeping people afraid and divided. But true strength comes from connection, from the courage to reach out and discover you are not as alone as you believed. 6 months passed like a slow exhale. Spring arrived in Willowbrook Estates with the tentative optimism of new beginnings, crocuses pushing through soil that had been frozen for too long, trees budding with leaves that seemed greener than I remembered. I stood in my front yard on a Saturday morning in April, tending to a small garden I had planted along the walkway. Flowers had never been my thing before all this happened, but somewhere between the surveillance footage and the court hearings, I had discovered that putting my hands in dirt and watching things grow offered a kind of peace that no amount of legal vindication could provide. The fence separating my property from the house next door had been completely rebuilt over the winter. Fresh cedar planks standing straight and solid where that loose panel had once invited theft. I ran my hand along the wood sometimes, feeling the smoothness of new construction, reminding myself how much had changed. The house next door had been sold in February, purchased by a young couple named the Parkers, who had no idea about its history until after they signed the paperwork. Michelle Parker was 32, a pediatric nurse with an easy laugh and twin daughters who treated my lawn as an extension of their playground. Her husband, James, worked in construction management and had already volunteered to help 3 neighbors with home repairs in the 2 months since they moved in. They were the opposite of Pamela Kensington in every conceivable way, warm where she had been cold, generous where she had been grasping, present in the community rather than hovering above it like a surveillance drone. One afternoon, Michelle knocked on my door holding a freshly baked apple pie, still warm from the oven. She told me she had read about what happened before they bought the house, had seen the news coverage and the viral video and the whole Purple Pamela phenomenon. She wanted me to know they were grateful, not just for what I had done to expose a criminal, but for what I had done to change the neighborhood itself. She explained that they had almost purchased a different house in a different suburb, but the reviews had scared them off. Too many complaints about an aggressive HOA. Residents are warning potential buyers to stay away. Then they found Willowbrook Estates, where the recent reviews told a completely different story. People wrote about a community transformed, about new leadership that actually listened, about neighbors who looked out for each other instead of reporting each other for minor infractions. The Parkers chose this neighborhood specifically because of what it had become. And what it had become was a direct result of everything that had happened over the past year. Michelle did not use the word hero, but the implication hung in the air between us. I told her I was just a guy who got tired of having his packages stolen. She smiled and said, "Sometimes that is exactly how heroes start." I called my mother that evening, something I had been doing more frequently since the trial ended. Barbara Reed listened as I described the Parkers, the pie, the strange feeling of being thanked for something that had begun as pure self-interest. She laughed softly and reminded me of a conversation we had months ago, when I was still drowning in frustration, and she told me to stop waiting for others to validate my experience. She said she knew then that I would figure it out, that I had too much of her stubbornness to surrender without a fight. But she also admitted she had been worried, afraid that the system would crush me the way it crushed so many others who dared to push back against entrenched power. She was proud of me, she said, not because I won, but because I refused to let winning be defined by anyone other than myself. We talked for almost an hour, longer than we had spoken in years, filling silences that had accumulated between us with words that felt long overdue. The next morning, I opened my front door to find a package on the porch. For a split second, old instincts kicked in, that familiar tension of wondering whether it would still be there when I returned. Then I remembered that those days were over. I picked up the box and carried it inside, noting the Amazon label and the tracking number that matched an order I had placed the previous week. Inside was a 2 terabyte solid-state drive, the exact model that had been stolen 8 months ago, sent as a replacement by a customer service representative who had finally processed my original claim. I held the drive in my hand for a long moment, turning it over, remembering the deadline it was supposed to meet, the project it was supposed to save. That deadline had passed months ago. The project had been completed with a different solution. The drive itself was essentially useless to me now, an artifact from a version of my life that no longer existed. I put it in a drawer anyway, not because I needed it, but because it felt like closing a chapter, the last physical evidence of what had started this whole journey, finally delivered to its rightful owner. The neighborhood block party happened in late May, the first one Willowbrook Estates had hosted in over 5 years. Pamela had always found reasons to shut down such gatherings, citing noise ordinances or permit requirements or insurance concerns that conveniently evaporated under her successor's leadership. Now the cul-de-sac at the end of Oakwood Lane was filled with folding tables and lawn chairs, children running between yards, the smell of grilled burgers mixing with the sound of music playing from someone's portable speaker. I wandered through the crowd, accepting handshakes and small talk from people whose names I was still learning. Neighbors who had lived within 100 yards of me for months, but whom I was only now beginning to know. Jake Morrison had appointed himself DJ for the event, his questionable taste in music earning good-natured complaints that he cheerfully ignored. Marcus Webb stood near the drinks table, telling legal war stories to anyone who would listen, his retirement clearly agreeing with him. Even the Nelsons were there, their children playing tag with the Parker twins in a scene that would have been unimaginable a year ago. Emily Hartman found me near the edge of the gathering as the sun began to set. She looked different than she had at the trial, more relaxed, more present, as if a weight she had carried for years had finally been set down. She told me this was the first community event she had attended since Pamela began targeting her family. For years, she had avoided any situation where she might encounter the woman who held such terrible power over her life. Now Pamela was gone, facing federal charges and civil suits, and a future that held nothing but consequences. Emily said she had started therapy, finally processing the trauma she had suppressed for so long. She was learning that what happened to her was not her fault, that silence in the face of abuse is a survival mechanism, not a character flaw. She thanked me for showing her that fighting back was possible. I told her she had shown herself. I just happened to go first. That night, after the party wound down and the street returned to its usual quiet, I sat on my back porch watching stars emerge above the rebuilt fence. My phone buzzed with an email from someone named Sarah Chen in Phoenix, Arizona. She had found my contact information through a news article and wanted advice. Her HOA president had been harassing residents for years, filing false violations, manipulating elections, and creating an atmosphere of fear that kept everyone silent. She did not know what to do. She felt alone and powerless and crazy, convinced that no one would believe her even if she spoke up. I read her message 3 times, remembering exactly how that isolation felt. Then I began typing a response. I told her she was not alone, that the first step was documentation, that the system could be beaten if you approached it with patience and evidence, and the stubborn refusal to accept injustice as inevitable. I told her about cameras and spreadsheets and legal statutes. I told her about finding allies in unexpected places. I told her that the truth does not need permission to exist. It only needs someone brave enough to speak it. I hit send and set down my phone, looking up at the night sky with something that felt remarkably like peace. The cycle was continuing. One person reaches out, another reaches back. That is how communities heal. That is how justice spreads. And that is how ordinary people, armed with nothing but evidence and determination, change the world one stolen package at a time. If this story reminded you that justice is possible when you refuse to stay silent, you are exactly the kind of person who belongs here. At Karma Fence, we believe every bully eventually meets their match, and every victim deserves to see that moment. Subscribe, so you never miss another satisfying, 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 satisfying story of karma delivered. Drop a comment telling me about a time you stood up for yourself, or share this with someone who needs to know they are not alone. One voice starts the change. Let yours be next.